Truth.
What if the world's poorest country decided to walk away from the IMF? No more loans, no conditions, no begging. In July 2023, Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African country most people can't find on a map, announced a $200 billion plan to rebuild itself. Without international aid, without debt, just local hands, national pride, and a leader who's only 35 years old. The world's reaction: silence from the IMF, panic in global markets, and then a twist no one saw coming. A $12 billion lifeline from the Islamic world. No strings attached. So what does this mean for global finance, for Africa, and for us? This is not just a story about Burkina Faso. It's a story about what happens when the global south stops asking for permission. Burkina Faso didn't ask for permission, it didn't call for a summit, it didn't request a bailout. On July 26, 2023, it simply made a choice: we're walking away. No IMF, no World Bank, no strings. In a world where financial sovereignty is a fantasy for most developing countries, this landlocked West African nation, known more for coups than capital, decided to turn its back on the global script. And it didn't whisper. It roared. The announcement came not from a corporate boardroom, but a military barrack, delivered by a 35-year-old leader in camouflage fatigues, speaking straight into the lens of national television. His words weren't polished. They were raw. We will rebuild this country with our hands, without debt, without foreign conditions. It sounded reckless, but also strangely honest. The rest of the world blinked. Newsrooms in Paris, London, and New York scrambled to verify the $200 billion figure. Could a country with a GDP smaller than a mid-sized U.S. city possibly fund one of the largest public infrastructure plans on the continent without borrowing a cent? While headlines hesitated, the people of Burkina Faso didn't. Markets opened early the next morning with handwritten signs: "We are not an economic colony." In the northern towns of Kaya and Dori, parents brought stones and wood to help rebuild abandoned schools. In Ouagadougou, university students pledged to teach for free. For the first time in decades, belief was trending faster than Bitcoin. That was the real shock. And it wasn't just ideology fueling this, it was fatigue. Decades of loans had paved roads to nowhere. Imported development models had created data sheets, not dignity. So when a young captain stood up and said, "Enough," he wasn't speaking to diplomats. He was speaking to mothers without clean water, farmers without electricity, teachers with no chalk or boards. This wasn't rebellion, it was realism. The kind the IMF spreadsheets had never accounted for. And while Washington warned of macroeconomic instability, Burkina Faso called it a new beginning. Not everyone bought it, but for those on the ground, hope was finally speaking their language. The announcement came like thunder in a dry sky: $200 billion over 10 years. Roads, electricity, water, agricultural zones, clean energy. Not just policy points on a PDF, real physical things in a country where most villages don't have a paved road or running water. The plan was specific, and more importantly, it was local. Traoré's government didn't outsource the blueprint. They met with elders in Dori, engineers in Bobo-Dioulasso, students in Ouagadougou. The first 24 months would target survival: transport routes, solar microgrids, well stations, school reconstructions. In the US, this would be a federal budget line. In Burkina Faso, it's a revolution in motion. But here's the catch. No IMF loans, no bond market juggling, no waiting on a rating agency to decide whether their children deserve light or not. Instead, the funding would come from within: regional alliances, Sovereign tax on mining, diaspora contributions, even small capital pulls from farmer cooperatives. Risky, maybe. Bold, absolutely. But in a world where aid often looks like a credit trap, what if this gamble is actually the safest bet they've ever made? And more importantly, why does it make so many people uncomfortable? Because when a country stops begging and starts building, it shifts the power dynamic. And for a lot of institutions, that's more dangerous than default. The question is no longer, is this viable? The real question is, what happens if it works? And here's where it gets personal. Imagine your town decided to stop waiting on Washington, Wall Street, or Brussels to approve its future. Imagine your neighbors chipping in not for charity but for ownership. Would you call it crazy? Or would you call it freedom? If any of that stirs something in you, drop a comment. Say what you'd build first if your town had zero debt and total freedom. Or just share this with someone who's ever been told to stay in their place. Maybe today's the day someone needs to hear that a different model is possible. Maybe it starts with a story. Maybe that story is right here. For over 60 years, Africa's economic blueprint has followed one script: borrow low, spend less, sell fast. The IMF model, exported across the continent after independence, was clean on paper: low-interest loans, market liberalization, public sector cuts, and privatization. On spreadsheets, it promised sustainable growth. On the ground, it built a generation that knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Burkina Faso was no exception. Roads built with borrowed money crumbled before they were paid off. Hospitals privatized by decree stood empty in rural towns. Schools closed, but the debt never did. Now imagine ripping that entire system out at the root. That's what Traoré's government is doing. No more dancing for credit ratings. No more policy edits faxed in from Paris. Instead, they're building around a simple truth. Value isn't created when you export raw goods. It's created when you keep the process, the jobs, and the profits at home. So rather than sell cotton or cashews to foreign buyers, the new plan is to process them domestically. Add value, retain margins, and circulate wealth inside. The IMF has long called this high risk. Traoré calls it common sense. This isn't theoretical. The government's already mapping agro-industrial parks across major regions, designed by local engineers, run by local managers, staffed by locals. It's not just about avoiding debt, it's about avoiding extraction. For too long, Africa has exported raw gold and imported finished jewelry, sent out raw uranium and bought back electricity at a markup. Burkina Faso wants to end the cycle, not with protests but with production. And here's the twist most didn't see coming: this shift isn't fueled by ideology, it's fueled by exhaustion. The average Burkinabe isn't quoting Marx or waving anti-imperialist flags. They're just tired of watching their land get mined, their kids go hungry, and their leaders ask permission to fix it. When they say no more, it doesn't sound like rebellion, it sounds like breathing for the first time. The IMF can downgrade ratings, banks can walk away. But when people realize they've been participating in their own disempowerment, that's when systems collapse. Not through revolution, but through refusal. You can't blueprint a future from a boardroom. At least that's how Burkina Faso sees it now. After announcing its national development plan, the government didn't huddle with foreign consultants, they hit the road. Literally. In towns like Titao, Seba, and Aribinda, ministers sat in plastic chairs while farmers drew road maps in the dirt. One teacher in Dori said it best: "We don't need another plan we didn't ask for. We need boards to write on and lights to see after dark." So that's where they started. Not with stadiums or skyscrapers, but with solar panels, boreholes, and one-classroom schools built with local hands and whatever material was available. In 5 provinces, a pilot program launched, pairing one trained local teacher with one village. No imported NGOs. No international frameworks. Just Burkinabe people educating Burkinabe kids in their own language. Development wasn't happening to them, it was happening with them. And that shift changes everything. When you build a clinic with your neighbors, you don't just get medicine, you get ownership. When an engineer from Bobo Dioulasso oversees a bridge in her hometown, the cement isn't just strong, it's personal. It's not about saving costs, it's about reclaiming authorship. For the first time in decades, people weren't just passive recipients of change. They were the change. There's a story from the South that doesn't show up in policy briefs. A retired mason named Yakalba used to walk 3 hours to reach a hospital that couldn't treat him. Last month, he helped lay bricks for a new rural clinic. He's 67, he doesn't have a pension, but he says he sleeps better now. Because I'm not waiting anymore, I'm doing something. And maybe that's the point. Not everything starts with money. Sometimes it starts with hands or a shovel or an idea too stubborn to die. If this kind of story matters to you, the kind that doesn't make headlines but still moves the world, hit subscribe. Because stories like these don't need a spotlight, they need a witness. Maybe that witness is you. The pushback didn't take long. Just 1 week after Burkina Faso announced its $200 billion plan, a Western credit rating agency quietly downgraded the country's status to negative. No breakdown. No hard data, just 5 words: policy risks and macroeconomic instability. That single sentence triggered a chain reaction. Borrowing costs soared, commercial banks froze funding, and international partners began delaying infrastructure deals. All before the first brick was laid. It wasn't a bullet, it was a whisper. And that's how modern systems punish disobedience, quietly, strategically, and without fingerprints. Nobody declared war on Burkina Faso. But funding streams evaporated. Logistics corridors slowed down. Ports in Côte d'Ivoire began holding Burkinabe goods longer in customs. Nigeria canceled a joint energy meeting. Even the Regional Economic Bloc, ECOWAS, supposedly a union of neighbors, started pulling technical support and ramping up pressure behind closed doors. The message was clear: play by the rules or play alone. But here's where it gets messy. These weren't just foreign tactics. Some of the loudest criticism came from within. Domestic analysts warned the plan was too ambitious, too vulnerable to corruption, too detached from financial reality. Even some urban elites, long comfortable with the donor-driven model, called it political theater. And maybe that's the deepest twist of all. When a nation tries to rise without a handout, the first to question it are often its own. Still, something strange was happening. While the system pushed back, the streets didn't. In Ouagadougou, thousands marched under the banner, "We are not an economic colony." They didn't chant against France or America or the IMF. They chanted for themselves, for control, for dignity, for a seat at the table they'd never been invited to. And outside the capital, something even rarer emerged: trust. A mother in Guernsey told a local journalist, "This time it's different. They're not promising from above, they're building from below." And maybe that's why the pressure is so intense. Because this isn't just an economic shift. It's a psychological one. And once people believe they don't need saving, they start acting like they're already free. No one expected Riyadh to get involved, or Jakarta, or Doha. For years, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, had remained mostly silent on Africa's internal struggles. But 2 weeks after Burkina Faso's credit rating was cut, something shifted behind closed doors. At a quiet summit in Saudi Arabia, a coalition of Muslim-majority nations, including Qatar, Iran, Indonesia, and the UAE, announced a strategic fund. $12 billion in direct support for AES countries, starting with Burkina Faso. No policy reforms required, no currency controls, no lectures on good governance. Just money, infrastructure technology, and clean energy partnerships with zero political strings. For a country that had just been iced out of global credit markets, it was oxygen. For the Western financial order, it was a rupture. Burkina Faso didn't ask for this, But they became the symbol anyway. Their stance, radical by design, had accidentally opened a second door, one not managed by Wall Street, Brussels, or the IMF. And suddenly, the question wasn't just whether their plan was realistic. It was whether their defiance had triggered a new lane for the global South. The twist wasn't just financial, it was philosophical. The OIC didn't frame its support as charity. They framed it as solidarity. A shared belief that development shouldn't be conditional and sovereignty shouldn't be transactional. That idea hit hard in places like Mali and Niger, nations facing similar isolation for similar reasons. And behind the headlines, quiet shifts began. Togo and Guinea-Bissau sent technical teams to observe Burkina Faso's agriculture zones. Ghana, though publicly silent, began discussions on cross-border solar grid integration. What had seemed like one country going rogue now looked like a movement quietly taking shape. And the silence from the West said more than any press release. No public condemnation, no official pushback, just tightening behind-the-scenes pressure and nervous recalculations. Because if a poor, landlocked country can build an alliance outside the global financial mainstream, what stops others from trying? What the IMF once called noncompliance was starting to look a lot like leadership. While global headlines shifted to the next crisis and Western institutions recalibrated their forecasts, something quieter was unfolding inside Burkina Faso. It didn't make the news. It didn't trend. But it was happening in villages with no signal, on roads with no names. In Kaya, a poor commune in the north, a local teacher named Madu started evening classes under kerosene lamps. He didn't wait for a government contract. He just showed up. In Tidau, a group of architecture students returned home to rebuild their community center using clay, recycled timber, and their own blueprints. They called it freedom architecture. And in churches and mosques across the country, the message shifted. Priests and imams no longer prayed for foreign aid. They prayed for strength to finish what had already begun. This wasn't nationalistic hype. It was a spiritual recalibration, one where people stopped asking Paris or Washington for a future and started drawing one in chalk and sweat on their own soil. Faith didn't come from outside, it rose from the ground up. Outside, financial pundits debated risk assessments. Inside, farmers repaired irrigation canals by hand. Kids shared books under mango trees. Masons rebuilt schools they were never allowed to attend. They didn't call it a revolution. They just called it Tuesday, and maybe that's the lesson. Not every change comes with a press release. Some begin when people decide that being poor doesn't mean being powerless. That sovereignty isn't given, it's practiced. That dignity isn't a theory, it's a habit. In late June, at a small church on the outskirts of Ouahigouya, a pastor closed his sermon with a line that didn't make international news, but echoed far deeper than policy briefings ever could. Faith doesn't require we be rich. It only requires we believe what is right, even when the world says it's wrong. Burkina Faso is not perfect. It's poor, scarred, and still rebuilding. But it has one thing many richer nations have long lost: collective belief, and the courage to act on it. So maybe this isn't the story of a nation rejecting the world. Maybe it's the story of a nation finally recognizing itself. You don't have to agree with every decision Burkina Faso made. You don't have to believe it will all work. But if, even for a moment, this made you question what we call normal, then maybe that's enough. Stories like this don't shout. They whisper something dangerous, that there are other ways. If this moved you, hit subscribe. Not because we ask, but because it helps more stories like this get seen, shared, and heard. Drop a comment. Tell us what part hit you hardest. Share this with one person who still thinks small countries can't make big moves. And if you're ready to keep questioning the world we take for granted, we've got another story coming next. Different country, same shift. You'll want to see it.